مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. هيمن على أجواء السياسة الأميركية التغيير الذي حصل بحلول كامالا هاريس مكان جو بايدن كمرشحة عن الحزب الديمقراطي. لكن العالم لم يقف عند قرار الأميركيين بمن سيكون رئيسهم القادم. ففي أوروبا انتقلت أوكرانيا إلى الهجوم مستخدمة أسلحة جديدة للهجوم داخل روسيا. وفي الشرق الأوسط بادرت إسرائيل بالهجوم أيضا مستهدفة قادة إرهابيين في داخل كل من إيران ولبنان. هل ستؤثر هذه التحركات من التوازن بين الحرب والسلام؟ وكيف سيتصرف الرئيس بايدن بعد انسابه كمرشح للرئاسة؟ وهل ستؤثر حملتنا الانتخابية على تلك الصراعات أم أن هذه الصراعات ستؤثر على انتخاباتنا؟ لمناقشة العلاقة بين السياستين الخارجية والداخلية في الأسابيع الأخيرة من الحملة الرئاسية، يسرني أن أستضيف دينيس روس ووان زراتي. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. There have been huge changes in American politics, but the world goes on. Let's explore the connection between what happens here in America and what's happening around the world with my guests, Juan Zarate and Denis Ross. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me this morning. So while we've been focused on the switch from Joe Biden to Kamala Harris, the world did not stop spinning. In fact, two of our key allies went on the offensive. Ukraine hitting deep inside Russia, and Israel hitting terrorists deep inside Iran and Lebanon. Let's take a look at both of these stories. First, Ukraine. How is that conflict evolving in the context of our politics? Juan, let's start with you.
Rob, Ukraine and Russia has become a centerpiece of the foreign policy debate in the American political scene, of course, with the Democratic Party and the Republican Party in many ways switching sides where they have sat traditionally in terms of their hawkishness and their position on foreign policy. But what Ukraine has done in recent days with its offensive into Russia is to really change both the perception and the calculus of what's happening in that environment. I think the perception in recent months is that Ukraine had reached a stalemate, if not was losing, that Russia was gaining the upper hand, and that the West was tiring in its support of Ukraine. And what Ukraine has done is taken the support it's gotten, including with materiel, fighter jets and artillery and other weaponry, and gone on the offensive and really caught Putin and the Russian forces flat-footed and changed the dynamic, not only on the ground, but politically, which is to say, Ukraine looks again like it can win, or at least is not suffering at the hands of a potential defeat by Russia. What that does in the U.S. is it sharpens the debate about what U.S. support will look like in the coming months during the change of an administration. And the Democrats have been steadfast in their support of Ukraine, their anti-Russian views, whereas on the Republican side, we've seen with Trump and J.D. Vance, the vice presidential candidate, much more equivocation and much more doubt about the continued support, at least at past levels, from the U.S. And so Ukraine has done its best, I think, to change the narrative on the ground. The political narrative in the U.S. has remained largely the same.
And Denis, to what extent do you think the Ukrainian decision to go on the offensive against Russia is actually driven by potential fear that Donald Trump and J.D. Vance may be taking over the White House come November?
I think it was an important element. I'm not saying it was necessarily decisive, but I think it was an important element. I think there was a general concern that Zelensky had that not just the U.S., but the West as a whole might be increasingly inclined to press him to negotiate on terms that would amount to a surrender. And he understood that he had to change the dynamic. And the way to change the dynamic was to show that Ukraine could surprise the Russians, could take Russian territory, in the course of which he would be crossing one of the so-called Putin red lines. One of the reasons we and others have held back in terms of limiting first the kinds of weapons that Ukraine could use, and then the way they could employ those weapons, including attacking in depth in Russia to sort of hit what would be staging areas for attacks against Ukraine, was that you couldn't cross certain red lines, one of which was if you went into Russian territory, that would produce this unbelievable escalation. It could produce a broader war between the West, the US, and Russia, something that from the beginning we've sought to understandably want to avoid. One of the things he highlighted was that that's not such a risk, that Putin understands well that he's not in a position where he can go to war with the NATO countries, number one. But number two, also send the signal that, look, we now have cards to play in any negotiations. If you want to think about negotiations, fine. We now hold Russian territory. And that can be an important card to play in negotiations. I believe that what we've seen here is a move driven not solely by concern about the West, but also a desire on Zelensky's part in particular, not just to build morale within Ukraine, which I think this has done, but also basically to say, okay, we can go to a negotiation now because we have cards that we can trade. Before he didn't have that, now he does.
And so, Juan, when you play back what's going on in the Ukraine-Russia battlefront to our own domestic politics, is it likely to, are we likely to hear Republicans, Donald Trump, talk about fear of a widening war and concern about what Putin is likely to do? Or, are we going to back a winner? Donald Trump always likes to talk about backing a winner. Is it likely to shift the Republican narrative that, well, maybe Ukraine is doing better than we thought?
Yes, I think Trump is at odds with himself at times with the narrative, because a large part of his foreign policy, national security narrative and critique, frankly, of the Biden-Harris administration is that not only is the world on fire with more conflict now, but we are walking blindly into World War III. And you hear that on the campaign stump. You hear that as part of his criticism. And so this idea of the U.S. Falling into a broader war, either by design or by happenstance, is a fundamental part of the Trump campaign. On the other hand, Trump also likes to style himself as the aggressive deterrent agent when he talks about, for example, Russia would have never have invaded Ukraine if he had been the president, and that the Iranians have feared him, and that October 7th would never have happened in Israel if Donald Trump had been the president. And so there's a part of the Trump mantra that is isolationist, if you will, or fearful of the broad escalation. On the other hand, much more aggressive and provocative in terms of the use of American power. And so in this case, I think if Zelensky looks like he's on the march, is on the offensive, if Ukraine actually can win, or at least have a positive position in a negotiating situation, that I think lends itself to Trump wanting to back a winner, and certainly would be more sympathetic to Zelensky when Zelensky comes back for more requests for aid or allowance for the use of weaponry to attack in Russia. I do think this also challenges the Biden-Harris approach to restraint and a desire not to escalate. But I do think for the Trump administration, there's a little bit of a binary here that's in conflict with itself.
Fascinating. All right, let's shift to the Middle East. Dennis, at the moment, it is a high priority for the Biden-Harris administration to seek a ceasefire hostage release deal in Gaza. They've been saying this for weeks and weeks and weeks. It hasn't happened. Why hasn't it happened in your view? And is there anything the United States can do that it hasn't already done to make it happen?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons for why it hasn't happened. One starts with Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas. Since October 7th, he has had a hope and an expectation, an aspiration even, to trigger a wider regional war. I mean, I think in his own mindset that he was doing something that was historic and that would set in motion the demise of Israel. But it depended upon not just what Hamas did, it depended on an all-out war with Hezbollah in Israel. It depended upon the West Bank exploding. It depended on Israeli Arabs rising up. It depended upon all the Shia militias also coordinated firing against Israel, along with Iran as well. Now, what we've just seen is that Hezbollah, clearly Hassan Nasrallah, does not want a wider war with Israel. In fact, the Iranians pretty clearly don't want a wider war with Israel. Both of them are signaling they want to make statements when Israel does something towards them, which they did significantly. In the one case, killing Fuad Shukr, probably the second most important person in Hezbollah, someone who the U.S. should also had a high interest in eliminating, since he goes back to actually planning the Marine barracks attack in Beirut in 1983. So this is critical from Hezbollah not to look like they just took that, but also for the Israelis to take out Ismail Haniyeh at the time of the presidential inauguration in Tehran, where he's staying in the guest house of the Revolutionary Guard and they can't protect him. These are two acts by Israel that put both Hezbollah and Iran in a position where it has to have an answer. And yet what we've seen with Hezbollah was a very limited answer, and one where they claimed success when they didn't have it, and where we've seen from Iran now statements, including from the supreme leader, that talk about there's lots of ways to respond. One has to be accurate, one has to be precise, one has to think. It isn't only military. It doesn't mean there may not be some sort of military action, but it says a month later that each of them would like to make a statement, but by the same token, they don't want to get into a broader war. Now, why do I say all this in answer to your question? Sinwar thought that the negotiation of a ceasefire was actually not in his interest. Iran had said, Hezbollah had said, if there's a ceasefire, we won't carry out an attack. So from his standpoint, no ceasefire was a good thing. And he wasn't under enough pressure from the Israelis for him to be interested in seeking a reprieve. Now what he's seen is he's not likely to get what he was hoping for. So the question becomes, does he become more interested in reaching a deal? By the same token, Bibi Netanyahu has interpreted parts of what was required for the deal as signaling that he wouldn't have a win in Gaza, meaning he's insisting that Israel has to maintain a presence on the Philadelphia corridor. Now, there's a legitimate reason for being concerned about the Philadelphia corridor, because through Rafah and through the Philadelphia corridor, Hamas got everything it needed in Gaza, and therefore it would be able to rebuild itself. A lot of people talk about Gaza being an open-air prison. Maybe it was for the people who live there. It was not an open-air prison for Hamas. They got whatever they needed to build 300 miles of tunnels, to acquire a wide range of weapons-making capability in addition to weapons. So dealing with that, if you really want to prevent Hamas from being able to reconstitute itself, is important. The Israeli military doesn't seem to think that Israel actually requires a presence along there, but I think the prime minister has convinced himself at this point that it needs some kind of presence as a way of showing it has succeeded. So the question is that issue one that Sinwar will be prepared to compromise on now? Is it an issue on which Netanyahu is prepared to compromise? The administration presently is basically working out lesser issues, not unimportant, but lesser issues. Hamas has signaled one thing, that maybe they have more of an interest in the deal. They are apparently now giving the names of hostages who would be released, something they had been reluctant to do before. And Israel, for its part, is also giving the names of possible prisoners that it would be releasing on the Palestinian side. So we're seeing some movement, but not on what have been the critical obstacles to a deal.
Very interesting. So Juan, there was pretty heated war fever for a couple of weeks. The United States sent aircraft carriers, nuclear submarines to try to deter it. People were worried. The people were on the edge. But, it was very interesting. The price of oil never went up. In fact, the price of oil went down a little bit throughout all of this. I find that quite odd and interesting. How do you explain that?
It's a great question. I haven't looked at the oil markets in their fluctuations in that immediate period, so I can't answer specifically. But the oil markets are really liquid and fluid. I think, and they've also adapted, I think, to the conflicts, both the attacks by the Houthis in the Red Sea. And then the flare-ups of tension with Israel and in Gaza, and certainly with Lebanon and Iran. And so I think the markets have adjusted to a certain extent to the volatility of conflict. In addition, I think the oil markets are fairly liquid and fluid. And again, the dependence in the West, especially in the U.S., is not wholly on Middle Eastern oil. And so the supplies are coming out of the U.S., certainly out of Canada, out of the North Sea. There are other supplies that are out there. Nigeria's online, Libya's disrupted here and there. So the oil markets, go through these moments of fluctuation. And part of this is the psychology of how the markets see conflict. And in some ways, you could say, the markets saw exactly what Dennis described, which was a lot of saber rattling, but not a lot of desire to actually increase tension or to increase disruption of supplies. And so the price may have, in fact, reflected that psychology. But again, I'm not studying the oil markets day to day, so I can't say specifically, but I think that's probably what's happening. The other thing I think is really interesting, to Dennis's point, and important in terms of what Israel did preemptively with the attempted strikes by Hezbollah, because I think we're on the precipice of potential broader conflict in the Israeli north and with Hezbollah. Israel demonstrated its ability to be preemptive against the greatest threat that they have faced against Hezbollah, and the greatest fear, which is the missile barrage that would come south out of Lebanon. And that demonstration was not only good for Israel in terms of protecting its territory and its people, but also a good demonstration that it could preemptively deal with a conflict. And I think sent a real signal and shiver within Hezbollah, within Iran, that Israel, isn't as vulnerable as they think. And if they're going to get into a shooting battle that's intense like that, they're going to have real problems, which points to why Nasrallah doesn't want escalation, why the Lebanese certainly don't want to see a conflict on their border, and why I think Israel's done a nice job of tamping down the broader conflict from the ring of fire surrounding it.
Terrific. Very useful. When we come back after the break, we're going to get into some of the domestic issues regarding our foreign policy debate in our presidential election in just a moment. My guests again today include Dennis Ross. Dennis is my colleague and counselor to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Dennis has a quarter-century experience at high levels of government in bipartisan positions in the Reagan, Bush, Clinton, and Obama White Houses, including service as the president's special envoy for Middle East peace. Also with us is Juan Zarate. Juan is one of America's leading counterterrorism experts. He served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor for combating terrorism in the George W. Bush White House. So let's connect some of the issues we've been talking about to the political debate for our presidential election. Dennis, some people see considerable daylight between Joe Biden and Kamala Harris when it comes to national security issues. What do you think? Is there?
I'm not so sure there is. I'm not saying they're exactly the same, but it was very interesting to me. If you pay attention to Vice President Harris's, and I emphasize Vice President in this case, her speech, her acceptance speech at the Democratic Convention, she made a point of making it clear. She kind of embraces the concept that Biden has basically articulated from the beginning of the administration, which is there needs to be a rule-based order internationally, and it needs to be shaped by the U.S. leadership. She was very clear she's going to stand up against Putin. Maybe that's good politics in terms of competing with Trump, but it's also we're going to stand with Ukraine. As Juan said earlier, it raises questions. It highlights a gap with Trump and his vice presidential choice, J.D. Vance. So once you're going to stand up against Putin, once you're going to stand up for Ukraine, you're obviously making a statement about aggression. She made a point about Israel has the right to defend itself, and we're going to be there to ensure that Israel is able, has the means to defend itself. This was also in line, I think, with Biden. So I think in broad strokes, there's a lot of consistency in terms of the basic posture towards the world. This was a centrist presentation of U.S. interests internationally, covering only two issues effectively, but with an implication when it comes to the international scene more generally.
And Juan, what's your view of this? I mean, after all, the creeping isolationism of the Republicans let the Democrats occupy this huge space between liberal interventionism and sort of progressive restraint. You could take it all because the Republicans had sort of moved aside completely from this debate. When you parse what Kamala Harris has said and done, what do you see?
Well, I think there are some fundamental commonalities actually between the parties, which is interesting. I think support to Israel, both on the Republican and the Democratic side, has been largely consistent. I think on the fringes, you've had debates and questions, the progressive left and the kind of extreme isolationist right sort of questioning some things. But the heartland of foreign policy from both parties has been to support Israel, its right to self-defense, and frankly, to be fairly aggressive about that, despite the humanitarian concerns about what's happened in Gaza. So I agree with Dennis. I think Vice President Harris has had the tonality of lending credence to the concerns around humanitarian, concerns about what Israel's done in Gaza. I think her instinct is to trend left, but frankly, we don't know much about her foreign policy views. They're not well formed. They haven't been independent in that regard. And frankly, she doesn't have a long history like Joe Biden did of working with the Israelis, of being known by the Israelis, of having trust and confidence. And so I think there's a gap, perhaps not of policy so much, but of experience and of understanding. And I think that really might begin to bedevil her.
All right, absolutely fascinating. I want to thank you both for helping to explain the connection between our domestic political debate and the important events happening around the world, even as Americans very soon begin to go to the polls. Juan Zarate, Dennis Ross, thank you for joining me this week on داخل واشنطن. وصلنا إلى ختام هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كانت لديكم تساؤلات أو تعليقات حول موضوع هذه الحلقة، وخاصة عن تأثير السياسة الخارجية في انتخاباتنا الرئاسية، أرجو التواصل معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاج Inside Washington أو مباشرة @RobSatloff. أراكم في الأسبوع المقبل، وحتى ذلك حين شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.